Imagine this. You're sitting by a crackling fire in a thatched cottage somewhere in 13th century Europe. It's cold. It smells faintly of wet straw and sheep. And your only entertainment is the neighbor's rooster trying and failing to crow at the moon. You have no coffee, no chocolate, not even a proper chair. But on the table, next to a chipped clay cup, lies something far more interesting. A bundle of roots, a pinch of dried petals, and a jar of honey that hums slightly when you open it. Now, tell me honestly, wouldn't you be tempted to stir all that into wine and see what happens? That was medieval life in a nutshell: hard days, dark nights, and an endless curiosity about the mysterious powers growing just outside the door. Tonight, we're wandering through that foggy, fragrant world of medieval intoxication before getting high even had a name. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a soft fan, that little background hum that makes the world fade. And while you settle in, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? It's always amazing to see who's joining this sleepy circle from every corner of the world. All right then, let's step back into a time when medicine, magic, and mild insanity were all mixed in one cauldron. To modern eyes, the Middle Ages often seem gray and joyless, mud, plague, and too many layers of wool. But beneath that heavy fabric were very human hearts, curious, restless, and often very inventive. These people didn't just survive their world, they experimented with it. If you lived in a village where the greatest thrill of the week was watching a knight try to read aloud or counting how many people fainted during church from incense smoke, a mushroom that made you forget taxes for a few hours might have felt like a divine gift. And it wasn't all rebellion or hedonism. Medieval highs often hid behind respectable names, divine visions, prophetic dreams, sacred ointments. Whether it was a monk mixing herbs for prayer or a midwife calming a mother in labor, the line between healing and hallucination was a thin, mossy one. Let's begin with a favorite, henbane. Even the name sounds like trouble. A pale plant with small patterned flowers that smell faintly of doom. In small amounts, it soothed toothaches, eased childbirth, and helped you sleep. In larger doses, it helped you meet angels, or at least think you did. Monks grew it in monastery gardens, apothecaries brewed it into sleepy teas, and witches, or women accused of being witches, turned it into flying ointment, a salve rumored to make the body light enough to rise above the ground. Whether they truly flew or simply lay motionless imagining the journey, no one can say. But the stories stayed. Henbane contained chemicals that interrupted how the brain spoke to itself. The result? Time twisted. Faces melted. You might dance, cry, or sing with a cabbage, believing it was your long-lost uncle. For some, this was revelation. For others, a bad Tuesday. And then there was Mandrake, the drama queen of medieval plants. Shaped vaguely like a person, it looked so eerily human that people believed it screamed when pulled from the earth. A deadly, blood-curdling shriek. To avoid dying from the sound, people tied the root to a dog and fled, letting the animal do the digging. The poor creature usually didn't survive, but the harvester went home with a root shaped like a tiny body, said to bring luck, fertility, and possibly nightmares. Mandrake roots were dried, polished, and carried in pouches as charms. Some boiled them in wine to induce sleep before surgery. Others whispered that they could see visions of the future if they placed one under their pillow. In truth, the plant contained powerful hallucinogens, enough to make the strongest knight weep into his goblet. But that didn't stop anyone. Belladonna, meanwhile, was beauty and danger entwined. The beautiful lady, they called it. A few drops in the eyes made pupils wide and dark. The fashion of the day, women looked mysterious, dreamy, and slightly poisoned. Used in medicine, belladonna dulled pain. Used carelessly, it blurred reality until a candle flame seemed to sing hymns. It's hard not to admire their courage or recklessness. There were no labels, no controlled dosages. Nature was the dealer, and she didn't bother with disclaimers. Imagine an herbalist's cottage at dusk. Jars lined on shelves, each filled with leaves, seeds, and powders. The air thick with scents, earth, smoke, resin. Someone knocks at the door. A farmer, maybe, desperate for sleep after losing his son to fever. The healer nods, measures a pinch of this, a drop of that. She tells him to drink it before bed and to pray, just in case. Did it work? Maybe. Or maybe he dreamt he was flying above the village, laughing, free for one merciful night. Even monasteries, those bastions of sobriety, weren't immune. Monks cataloged these plants carefully. They saw them as gifts from God, tools to quiet the body so the soul might hear heaven. When the air inside a stone chapel filled with incense smoke, the faithful sometimes swayed, eyes half closed, murmuring visions of angels. Some claimed divine revelation. Others were probably just lightly high on frankincense. You see, burning frankincense and myrrh released compounds that gently affected the brain. Combine that with fasting, long chanting, and a few hours without fresh air, and transcendence was almost guaranteed. Meanwhile, in the East, things got a little more sophisticated. In the golden cities of Persia and Egypt, people used hashish, cannabis resin mixed with honey and spices. It wasn't just for pleasure. Mystics believed it opened the mind to God. Poets wrote about it the way musicians write about heartbreak, half truth, half trance. Back in Europe, the experiments were more chaotic. Peasants drank beer because water was dangerous. Bread sometimes caused hallucinations because of a fungus called ergot. Villagers danced wildly for days, convinced demons had possessed them, when in reality they'd just eaten infected rye. And through all this honey, the innocent hid a secret weapon. In the mountains of what's now Turkey, bees fed on rhododendron flowers, creating what people called mad honey, sweet, amber, and faintly toxic. A spoonful could calm pain. 2 spoonfuls could make the walls breathe. Whole armies were once defeated after raiding honeycombs left deliberately by locals. They thought they'd found treasure. Instead, they found enlightenment and nausea. When we talk about medieval getting high, it's tempting to laugh. But underneath the absurdity lies something deeply human, a search for relief, meaning, and sometimes joy in a hard, uncertain world. Whether you were a monk seeking God, a mother seeking rest, or a weary soul seeking escape, you turned to what you had: roots, herbs, smoke, and faith. So maybe tonight, as you listen to this with the lights low and the hum of your own modern world fading, remember them? The dreamers in wool and shadow who looked at the earth and thought, maybe this will help? Because, in a way, they weren't so different from us. Picture a small monastery in the heart of France around the year 1270. The night is cold, the candles burned low, and a monk named Brother Mathieu tends his garden of medicinal herbs. To outsiders, it's a modest patch of soil. To him, it's a map of the human soul. He kneels beside the henbane plants, their bell-shaped flowers pale in the moonlight. He whispers a prayer, not to bless the plant, but to warn it. "We use you kindly," he says, "not greedily." For Mathieu knows what happens when someone forgets that part. Inside the monastery, the air is thick with the smell of incense and damp stone. A brother coughs softly in his sleep. Another murmurs a psalm, half dreaming. The mix of smoke and fatigue works its way into their minds, blurring the line between prayer and hallucination. The next morning, Mathieu writes in the herbal book, "Used with care, the plant grants rest. Used without, it opens gates better left closed." And yet, those gates tempted everyone. The Middle Ages were not kind to the body or the mind. Cold, hunger, plague, and fear made every small escape precious. In the cities, apothecaries sold powders that promised to calm nerves and brighten moods. In the countryside, women gathered roots in silence, their baskets heavy with half magic, half medicine. Imagine one of them, Isolde, a healer from a damp English village. She knew the forest better than she knew her neighbors. Her remedies came from mossy roots and whispered knowledge passed down through generations. She had learned that poppy sap brought peace to the dying, that belladonna eased childbirth pains, that mandrake soothed the broken-hearted, or at least made them forget for a night. But when a man saw visions after her brew, he called it witchcraft. When his pain faded, he called it a miracle. Same potion, different story. It was all about intent. In a world ruled by faith, you could sip the same cup and either find God or meet the devil. Even the clergy couldn't escape that paradox. In Spain, monks grew poppies behind cloister walls and steeped their petals in wine. The result was called Dormitorium Dei, the sleep of God. It was used to ease pain, but also to open the mind for meditation. A few sips too many, and the meditation became a full conversation, with voices only one man could hear. Still, the church tolerated it. For how could one condemn what grew in God's own earth? Outside those sacred walls, however, things were more dangerous. In remote villages of Germany, people began to dance. Not in joy, not in festival, but in fits. Whole groups would gather in a frenzy, spinning, shouting, weeping until they fell to the ground. Locals called it the dancing plague. Priests said it was the devil's work. Centuries later, scientists would realize the cause: ergot fungus growing quietly on rye bread. They didn't know it, of course. To them, it was possession. To us, it's history's first accidental acid trip. Even bread, the symbol of life, could become a doorway to visions. Further east, the story took another shape. In the busy markets of Cairo and Baghdad, merchants sold a dark resin wrapped in silk. It smelled of spice and smoke, hashish. Scholars debated its morality while poets sang its praises. It softens the heart, one Sufi wrote, and opens the eye within the soul. They didn't use it to forget. They used it to remember, to blur the world enough to see what lay beyond it. For the mystics of the Islamic Golden Age, hashish wasn't sin. It was a key to contemplation. They gathered in courtyards under stars, speaking softly, laughing slowly. The rhythm of flutes drifted in the air. Someone recited Rumi. The world turned gentle and round. Meanwhile, back in medieval Europe, people were still rubbing ointment on their skin and hoping not to die. The flying ointments of legend, mixtures of belladonna, henbane, and animal fat, were meant to induce spiritual journeys. But because they were absorbed through mucous membranes, yes, those, they also caused wild hallucinations. Those who used them described floating through the sky, attending dark feasts, or traveling beyond their own bodies. To inquisitors, this was proof of witchcraft. To the users, it was proof that they had touched something divine, or at least very confusing. No one truly flew, of course. But try telling that to a woman who just spent the night soaring above her village in a trance, her mind filled with colors that didn't exist in the waking world. Even centuries later, trial records describe these sensations with eerie consistency: levitation, vivid lights, meetings with spirits, all symptoms of plant-based hallucinogens, but to medieval minds, it was unmistakably magic. It's easy to laugh at them now with our scientific hindsight. But think about it. If you'd never heard of dopamine or alkaloids, and one night you drank something that made the stars whisper secrets to you, wouldn't you believe it was the work of angels? That fragile balance between faith and chemistry shaped an entire era. In Italy, apothecaries began adding poppy extract to wine, a concoction called vinitum somniferum. It was used for pain, surgery, or heartbreak, which were often the same thing. A few spoonfuls could make a person dream of paradise. Too many, and paradise became permanent. But the people trusted it. After all, life was uncertain, death constant, and relief rare. In a small town in Flanders, a chronicler once described a woman who slept 7 days under the blessing of the poppy. He meant it kindly. She had survived childbirth, something few did. The potion had spared her from agony and perhaps brought her closer to the divine in her long sleep. In the same century, pilgrims burned incense in stone churches. Thick clouds rose from censers, swirling in shafts of colored light. Some said they saw shapes in the smoke, saints, doves, the Virgin herself. Perhaps they did. Or perhaps it was the frankincense gently altering their senses, just enough to turn longing into vision. Everywhere, people sought the same thing: escape. Not from morality or duty, but from the heaviness of life itself. The body was a prison, the herbs were a door. And yet, amid all the strange brews and fumes, there was an odd innocence. They weren't chasing euphoria the way modern minds might. They were chasing comfort, sleep, a moment without fear. And sometimes they found it. A nun named Agnes once wrote in her diary that she had dreamed of walking through a garden where every flower whispered her name. She thought it was heaven. Scholars now think it was hyoscyamin poisoning from her homemade salve. But perhaps both are true. Perhaps heaven was simply her brain, unburdened for a while by suffering. Somewhere tonight, 1,000 years later, someone might be burning the same resin, inhaling the same faint sweetness, listening to the same hum in their ears. History, after all, has its echoes. So tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Is it cold outside? Is the light dim enough to imagine that faint smoke drifting through the air? Let's drift a little further down the centuries into the hush of a medieval kitchen after midnight. The hearth is still warm. The coals glow a sleepy red, and beside them, a small pot simmers quietly. In it, wine, herbs, and something golden that clings to the spoon. Honey, but not just any honey. This one hums. Its surface glints with a faint shimmer, and the woman stirring it, an apothecary's widow named Catherine, knows to taste it only with the tip of her finger. She dips, touches, pauses, then smiles. In that corner of the world near the Black Sea, people whispered about mad honey. Honey made by bees who fed on mountain rhododendrons whose nectar carried strange dreams. Taken in small spoonfuls, it soothed the nerves and stilled the heart. Too much, and it could slow the heart to silence. Catherine sells her honey in small jars, sealed with wax and prayers. To old soldiers with shaking hands, to mothers who can't sleep after losing a child, to monks who claim to need clarity for their midnight prayers. And sometimes, when the nights are longest, she keeps a jar for herself. Mad honey has always been a trickster, healer, poison, and prophet. Ancient Greek writers already knew it could turn soldiers into trembling poets. Whole armies once collapsed after raiding honeycombs left behind as traps. But the locals never feared it. They respected it, the way one respects fire. In the medieval mind, every natural thing had a spirit. If a plant cured pain, it was because that spirit was merciful. If it caused madness, the spirit was testing you. So people learned to bargain with prayers, offerings, and small acts of superstition. Before harvesting herbs, healers might kneel and speak to the soil. "Forgive the taking," they'd murmur. "We borrow, not steal." Some tied ribbons on branches to appease forest spirits. Others recited psalms backwards while pulling roots, convinced it kept the demons out. Even medicine was theater, and faith was the script. Now picture a scene on the other side of Europe, a storm over the North Sea, a monastery on a cliff. Inside, a scribe is copying a medical treatise illuminated with vines and little gold dots that glimmer like stars. In the margin, he doodles a small figure of a monk holding a cup, eyes spinning like wheels. Beside it, he writes, "When taken too much, the patient may see heaven too soon." That patient's name is lost, but the humor isn't. It's a quiet acknowledgement that everyone, even the devout, danced close to the edge. Because in the Middle Ages, there was no neat line between the holy and the hallucinatory. When a monk said he had a vision of the Virgin, people believed him. When a woman said she flew through the night after using an herbal salve, people feared her. Both might have been describing the same chemical effect, the same rush of blood, the same swirl of lights behind closed eyes. It wasn't sin that determined the difference. It was status. If a priest dreamt of angels, it was grace. If a peasant woman did, it was witchcraft. And so, whole centuries of wisdom were silenced. The women who knew the plants best, who measured doses by instinct, became dangerous in the eyes of those who could not explain them. Yet, secretly, their knowledge lived on, passed in whispers, hidden in recipes, tucked inside psalters between the lines of Latin prayers. There's a story from Alsace about a nun named Hiltrude who made an ointment that could ease the soul from sorrow. She kept her ingredients secret, but one apprentice remembered two things clearly: a handful of henbane and a small drop of honey so dark it was almost red. "Did it heal?" the apprentice was asked years later. "She said it made people dream kindly," came the answer. In that simple phrase, "dream kindly," you can feel the heartbeat of a whole age. They weren't chasing thrill or oblivion. They wanted softness in a world made of stone. And yet, not all intoxication came from herbs or honey. Sometimes it was in the air itself. Picture a crowded cathedral during Lent, hundreds of candles burning, the incense swinging in long, slow arcs, smoke rising into the high vaults, thick enough to blur the frescoes. The choir chants, the air quivers. After 2 hours, Your stomach is empty, your lungs are full of resin, and your eyes water as light filters through the haze. You feel something lifting inside you, something tender, wordless, like being halfway between waking and dreaming. That was faith and a little chemistry. Frankincense releases compounds that subtly alter mood, lowering anxiety and evoking calm. In a world without antidepressants, that was as close as anyone could get to peace. The monks didn't know the science. They didn't need to. They simply called it grace. Everywhere you look in medieval life, the boundary between spiritual and chemical fades like smoke. Wine mixed with poppy juice for pain, beer flavored with henbane before hops replaced it, bread made with ergot-infected rye that made people see visions and devils alike, herbs burned in ritual, crushed into oils, folded into food. The world was alive with reactions no one understood, but everyone felt. And maybe that's why, when a medieval farmer looked at a strange flower glowing in the dusk and thought, maybe this can heal me, he wasn't wrong. He was simply speaking the only language of science he knew, the language of wonder. Even today, deep down, we still use that language. When you light a candle, breathe its scent, and feel calmer, you're doing the same thing. When you stare into a cup of steaming tea and think, this helps, you're whispering the same prayer those old healers once did. So perhaps it's not the substances that connect us to the past, it's the longing they answered, a longing to feel lighter, to see beauty, to dream kindly, and in that way medieval people weren't strangers at all. They were us, just with fewer safety warnings and a lot more faith in bees. The night stretches longer now, the fire burns lower, just a soft orange pulse on the wall. You can almost hear the hush of a medieval village outside, a dog barking once, a church bell echoing faintly through fog. Inside a small cottage, a woman named Ellen sits beside her sleeping husband. His breathing is shallow, each inhale a struggle. She's crushed a few dried poppy heads into a cup of warm ale. Her hands tremble as she stirs. No one taught her exact measurements. She learned by watching her mother and her mother before her. Just enough to soothe, never enough to steal the breath entirely. But when every remedy comes from nature's shadows, there's always risk. She touches the cup to her husband's lips. He drinks, then sighs. For the first time in days, his face relaxes. Ellen crosses herself and whispers, "Thank you, Lord," though she doesn't know whether she's thanking God or the poppy. That was the quiet truth of the medieval age. Every cure was a gamble, every prayer a kind of experiment. You could mix wine and opium to help a person rest before surgery, but too much, and the soul might slip away before the knife even touched the skin. You could boil mandrake root for a fever, but the line between healing and hallucination was as thin as a spider's thread, and yet people didn't fear it the way we might. They accepted that the world's gifts carried danger. That comfort had a price. Even doctors of the time, the learned men in long robes, spoke of balancing humors, not of chemicals. They thought madness came from an excess of black bile, not from ergot or nightshade, but beneath their Latin words, something ancient and human still pulsed. That unshakable belief that everything could be fixed if only you found the right leaf, the right smoke, the right whisper. In the great medieval hospitals, often run by monks and nuns, patients were treated with mixtures of herbs, prayer, and song. Imagine lying in a narrow bed beneath a painted ceiling of stars. A sister moves quietly between the cots. her linen veil brushing your hand as she checks your fever. She gives you a draught of wine spiced with saffron and poppy. Then she hums. You begin to drift. Somewhere, a psalm echoes through the corridor, mingling with the scent of rosemary and beeswax candles. That was healing, as close as they could come to peace. But sometimes, peace turned strange. Records from 14th century France describe patients who awoke from such potions, claiming they had seen visions of paradise. Bright gardens, golden rivers, their dead relatives smiling. Some later said they no longer feared death. Others refused to eat, saying the food of the earth tasted dull compared to what they had seen. What they had seen, of course, was chemistry, morphine molecules tickling their minds. But to them, it was proof of heaven. Even kings and queens weren't immune to these mysteries. When pain or grief grew unbearable, they too turned to what the earth offered. In 1463, for example, Margaret of Anjou's physicians gave her a sleeping wine of poppy and mandrake during her imprisonment. Chroniclers say she dreamed she was free again, walking through her gardens. No one called it intoxication. They called it mercy. Yet mercy had its shadows. Some people began to notice how unpredictable these miracle mixtures could be. A tincture that cured fever in one person drove another into delirium. A salve that healed a wound left someone else muttering to invisible friends for days. By the late Middle Ages, whispers spread, not of medicine, but of witchcraft. A woman who gathered herbs at night might be accused of speaking with demons. A healer whose potions worked too well risked the pyre. It wasn't always superstition. Sometimes it was fear disguised as faith. Because what terrified people most was the possibility that power might exist outside the church, in the hands of those who didn't wear robes or rings. And so, knowledge went underground. Recipes that once filled herbals were hidden in lullabies, in metaphors, in half-forgotten rhymes. Rosemary for memory, poppy for sleep, honey for kindness, and roots for the deep. Children repeated it as a song, not knowing it was a coded recipe for a calming balm. Meanwhile, across the sea, other worlds were awakening to their own forms of intoxication. In the Arab world, coffee was beginning to spread, black, bitter, electric. To the Sufis, it was not a stimulant, but a sacred focus, a way to stay awake in prayer and ecstasy. To Europeans, centuries later, it would feel like witchcraft of a different kind, a potion that banished sleep instead of summoning it. How strange that both the cup that wakes and the cup that dreams came from the same desire to change the way one feels, to reach beyond the dull limits of the body. Back in Europe, honey and smoke still ruled the night. People burned herbs to bless homes, to ward off plague, to invite love. The air in a medieval town was always scented, sometimes sweet, sometimes sickly, with things meant to protect the soul. Even in death, they used them. Rosemary for remembrance, lavender for rest, juniper to keep spirits away. Every life, every ritual, every dream wrapped in fragrance. And maybe that's why, when you read an old chronicle today, you can almost smell it, that faint mix of wax, dust, and dried flowers. It clings to history like perfume on old fabric, because, in the end, the Middle Ages were not a dark blur of ignorance. They were a time of experiment, of brave mistakes, of people trying to touch the divine through the only laboratory they knew, the fields and forests around them. So when you close your eyes tonight and breathe deeply, Imagine that same air, the same slow hum of bees in a meadow, the same hands grinding herbs by candlelight. We're not just hearing their stories. We're breathing the remnants of their curiosity. The night deepens, and the air feels heavier now, as if centuries themselves have thickened it. The candles flicker slower. You can almost imagine a monk walking down the corridor of time, his robe brushing the floor, carrying a small bowl that glows faintly in the dark. That glow comes from the oil of mandragora, mandrake root steeped in wine and fat. He's not heading to a witch's hut, though. He's walking toward the infirmary, where a young novice lies groaning with pain. The monk whispers a prayer, then rubs the salve on the boy's temples. Within minutes, the boy's breathing eases, and his eyes drift shut. Was it medicine or a miracle? In that century, there was no need to decide. The two were twins. Every culture before modern science blurred the same lines. Alchemy was not yet chemistry. Healing was still half spell, half art. What mattered most was intention and the courage to believe that the world's smallest things held the mightiest powers. In every medieval monastery, the herb garden was sacred ground, walled, geometric, divided into quadrants like a small universe. Each plant had its own meaning: sage for wisdom, lavender for purity, poppy for divine rest. The monks called the garden Hortus Conclusus, the enclosed paradise. At dusk, when the bells called for compline prayers, that paradise shimmered with scent. Bees moved lazily over thyme and rosemary. The air tasted of green, and sometimes, just sometimes, that air itself carried the faint trace of intoxication, because, you see, even without smoking, eating, or drinking a thing, certain herbs released alkaloids into the air when heated by sun or fire. Stand too long among them, and the world would seem to soften around you. Imagine it. Centuries of monks copying texts, their eyes aching, their hands cramped, their heads full of psalms and sleepiness. And just outside the window, a garden exhaling invisible calm. It's a gentle image, not scandalous, not mystical, simply human. And yet, when one monk confessed that during prayer he sometimes saw a light so sweet that I wept, the abbot wrote it down as a divine sign. In the margins, though, a later reader added a tiny note. Perhaps the garden was in bloom. Not every miracle needs wings. Some grow from the soil. The idea of sleep as a sacred act was powerful in that world. To sleep was to surrender control, to let the soul wander while the body rested. Dreams weren't dismissed as nonsense. They were taken seriously, recorded, even interpreted as messages. When a nun dreamed of angels whispering recipes for healing balms, no one laughed. The convent simply added a new salve to its stores. And if it worked, well, wasn't that proof that heaven spoke through her? Over time, the act of dreaming itself became a kind of laboratory. Some mystics fasted for days or drank special infusions before bed to cleanse the mind. Others inhaled smoke from burning herbs, said to purify the inner sight. It wasn't indulgence, it was research of the soul. One such mystic, Hildegard of Bingen, a real figure, abbess, composer, visionary, described her revelations as a light that burned not with pain, but with sweetness. She often fell ill afterward, trembling, her body weak, her pulse racing. Modern scholars think she might have suffered migraines or even got exposure from rye bread. But in her world, the cause was divine inspiration, and so her visions became symphonies. Her words illuminated manuscripts that glowed like stained glass. The line between chemistry and spirituality blurred again, and beauty bloomed in the space between. The people of that era didn't divide the world into sacred and secular the way we do. For them, the earth was full of spirits, not just in forests or rivers, but in every plant that eased pain or shaped dreams. When they boiled herbs, they weren't just making medicine. They were coaxing those spirits to be kind. When they lit incense, they weren't just masking the smell of the sick. They were calling heaven closer. When they tasted honey that tingled on the tongue, they weren't seeking a high, they were seeking harmony. Harmony. That's the word that threads through the medieval world like a golden string. Everything sought balance, heat and cold, wet and dry, sin and virtue, waking and sleep. To dream was not to escape life, it was to complete it. It's strange how much that idea has faded. We see sleep as a pause now, a break from productivity, but to them it was sacred, the hour when God might whisper, when ancestors might visit, when truth might appear wrapped in symbols. That's why they protected sleep with all those herbs. Lavender under pillows, mugwort near the bed, chamomile in warm wine, not just for scent or comfort, but because they believed dreams could heal. And sometimes they were right. A record from 1312 tells of a knight who returned from battle haunted by visions of blood. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, trembled at every sound. His wife, desperate, went to the local convent. The nuns gave her a sachet filled with lavender, sage, and crushed poppy petals, and told her to burn it in the hearth before bed. That night, the knight slept for the first time in weeks. He woke saying he had dreamed of walking through a meadow, his armor gone, his sword buried in the grass. He never fought again. Whether that was medicine, placebo, or grace hardly matters. It was peace. And that, perhaps, was the true alchemy of the Middle Ages, not turning lead into gold, but turning fear into rest. So as you listen now, let that idea settle gently into you, that every age, even one shrouded in darkness, was full of people trying to make the night kinder. Some used prayer, some used poppies, some used honey that glowed like dusk. But all of them, every monk, healer, farmer, and dreamer, reached for the same fragile miracle, the moment before sleep, when the world finally grows quiet. Outside, the world is quiet again. The rain has begun, a soft, steady sound like fingers brushing parchment. Inside the cottage, a single candle trembles beside an open jar of herbs. The woman sitting there listens, not to the storm, but to the faint hiss of her own mixture cooling down. Her name is Gertrude, though no one says it aloud anymore. They call her the midwife, sometimes the green woman, and sometimes, when crops fail or fevers spread, they call her worse. Gertrude lives near the edge of a German village, half healer, half rumor. She keeps her knowledge in a little book bound in goat skin, written in cramped Latin and fragments of old dialect. The pages smell of smoke and crushed flowers. On the first page, she has written, "Every root has two faces, one that heals, one that harms. It listens to your heart before it decides which to show." That's not poetry, it's survival. In her world, a healer must know when to speak and when to stay silent. She must know which herb soothes birth pains, which stops bleeding, which can make a cruel man sleep so deeply he forgets to wake. She must also know when to pretend ignorance if the wrong person asks, because the church doesn't look kindly on women who understand the body too well. So when Gertrude prepares her dream syrup for sleepless villagers, poppy seed boiled in milk, sweetened with honey and blessed with 3 whispered prayers, she sells it as holy comfort, never medicine, never magic. If anyone asks why her patients dream of fields of gentle light, of voices that forgive them, she only smiles and says, perhaps the angels visit those who finally rest. And in a way, she's right. Across Europe, thousands of women like her practiced the same humble sorcery, making life a little softer. Their tools were small things, a sprig, a spoon, a spark, but they were the guardians of peace in a brutal world. They knew the secret timings of plants. That mandrake pulled at dawn was safer than at dusk. That henbane gathered under the waning moon whispered more kindly than under the full. That every flower had moods, and that medicine was not just chemistry, it was conversation. Their world wasn't silent, you see. It rustled, hummed, sighed. A good healer didn't just collect plants. She listened to them. There's a story told in the Black Forest about an old woman who could tell what ailing soul lived in each herb. Rosemary carries the sorrow of widows, she once said. Time remembers soldiers. When she died, the villagers buried her with her mortar and pestle. Her grave grew wild with herbs no one could name. We think of the Middle Ages as superstition, but look closely, and you see early science disguised as myth. Observation turned into ritual. Data turned into prayer. Gertrude, for example, kept notes about how weather changed the strength of her herbs. She noticed that poppies harvested after rain made stronger sedatives. That mandrake, left too long in the cellar, lost its spirit. Without knowing it, she was recording environmental chemistry centuries before textbooks existed. But if anyone found that book, it could burn her. So she hides it under the floorboards, beneath a tile carved with a cross. Above it, she keeps a plain Bible. On Sundays, she sits in church and sings like everyone else. She's not a rebel. She's simply tired of watching people suffer when the earth offers help. One night, a writer arrives at her door. His wife, the baker's daughter, is giving birth too early. Gertrude lights a lantern and follows him through the mud, clutching her basket. Hours later, the child is silent, the mother feverish. The midwife grinds poppy seeds and mixes them into warm beer. The young woman drinks, sighs, sleeps. In the corner, the husband prays. When morning comes, the fever breaks. The baby breathes, and for one night more, the world believes in her. But not for long. A week later, another woman tries to copy her potion and gives too much. The patient dies. The whispers begin. She knows the devil's herbs. Gertrude buries her tools behind the garden wall. She leaves at dawn, walking into the forest with only a cloak and her book. No one ever sees her again. But for years, when the wind passes through that village at night, people say it smells faintly of crushed poppies. The legacy of women like her lived on, even when their names didn't. Their recipes resurfaced in apothecaries' manuals centuries later, signed by men who'd never ground a single root. But the knowledge itself remained intact, stubborn as the weeds it described. And that's the quiet irony of history. What's forbidden often lasts the longest, because truth hides well in the cracks of fear. Even as universities rose and science grew proud, the echoes of those old whispers lingered. Herbalism, midwifery, the strange music of scent and sleep, they survived in kitchens, convents, and dreams. And if you've ever brewed tea for comfort or opened a jar of honey, When life felt too sharp, you've spoken their language without knowing it. The same simple language Gertrude spoke when she touched a leaf and murmured, "Be kind." So, before we drift further, take a breath, smell the faint trace of your own evening air, whatever it holds, city dust or rain or soap. That's your era's version of her smoke-filled hut, her slow heartbeat, her faith in the small. Because every time someone seeks calm, they're calling back those vanished healers, those herb whisperers who once made the darkness gentle. The rain outside has slowed to a whisper, that soft rhythm the night plays when it knows you're listening. Somewhere far away, a bell tolls, a single note carried through the mist. Imagine now the world a little later in time, the same Europe, but different, more crowded, more curious, more awake. Towns swelling with trade, travelers bringing stories, spices, and strange powders from the East. For centuries, the human urge to alter the mind had been wrapped in herbs, smoke, and prayer. But now, the alchemy of the Renaissance was about to give that urge new shapes, bottled in glass and sealed with ambition. Let's begin with the stars. Astrology ruled medicine as firmly as the church ruled faith. Every illness, every remedy was thought to rise and fall with the heavens. If Mars was in retrograde, you bled a patient less. If the moon was full, you gathered herbs by its light. And so, when people began mixing metals with wine or distilling oils from flowers, they believed they were imitating the sky, turning the chaos of earth into something celestial. One of these early experimenters was a physician named Paracelsus. He carried a sword not for battle, but as a walking laboratory, the hilt hollow, filled with tinctures. To him, chemistry and divinity were the same pursuit. "Every herb is a star," he wrote, "and every star has its medicine." He distilled opium into laudanum, calling it the stone that brings sleep. In the right dose, it eased agony. In the wrong, it erased memory itself. It would later become the darling of poets and the downfall of cities. But in his day, it was a miracle in a bottle, clear, bitter, and just mysterious enough to feel holy. The church frowned, of course, but pain was persuasive. So the small glass vials spread quietly from monasteries to manors, from sailors to scholars. And for a time, people spoke of sleep as if it were an art, a place you could reach only by precise alchemy. But while men like Paracelsus chased enlightenment in laboratories, the villagers still had their simpler ways. In the valleys of Wales, shepherds swore that sleeping on a pillow stuffed with mugwort brought prophetic dreams. They'd wake before dawn, claiming to have seen tomorrow's weather or glimpsed their dead. In Italy, women wore lavender sachets to bed to sweeten the mind. In Transylvania, young brides placed a sprig of rosemary under the pillow to ensure gentle dreams and faithful husbands. Science hadn't yet separated from superstition. They shared a bed and slept soundly together. And everywhere, dreams remained the quiet theater of truth. Kings consulted dream interpreters before wars. Peasants confessed visions of saints to local priests. In taverns, men compared dreams the way we compare news headlines. "I saw a white horse," one would say. "Ah," another replied, "then you'll be summoned to travel." Dreams had currency. They were conversation, confession, and comfort all at once. And perhaps, somewhere in that tangle of belief and biology, people began to realize that the mind itself was an untamed country. Not heaven, not hell, but something deeply, stubbornly human. The sky had always seemed alive to them, full of spirits, voices, omens. But slowly, quietly, they began to hear a new sky, the one inside their heads. It started with the poets. In Florence, Boccaccio wrote of divine frenzy. In England, Chaucer described dreams so vivid they blurred with waking. Later, Shakespeare, whose world was steeped in the last smoke of medieval magic, gave us characters who saw ghosts, fairies, and forests that moved. Were they bewitched? Or just dreaming? And in the background of all that art, the old herbs kept working, laudanum in the ink of writers, wine spiced with nutmeg and clove to loosen tongues, candles of beeswax and myrrh to soften thought. Everything around them was, in its own way, a mild drug. If you had lived then, you might never have gone a day completely sober, not because you were reckless, but because the very air was filled with stimulants and sedatives, the bread, the ale, the incense, the fever tonics. Each carried a ghost of intoxication. Even the colors in the windows, the stained glass glowing red and blue, could feel like a high. Imagine sunlight streaming through a church nave, hitting your eyes after hours in shadow. The body reacts. The mind blurs. You feel small and infinite all at once. That, too, was a kind of trip. By the time the 16th century began, the church was losing its monopoly on dreams. The human mind was now being studied, mapped, dissected. But the fascination remained. What happens when we close our eyes? Why do we see what we see? Some thinkers said dreams were vapors rising from the stomach. Others said they were divine messages. A few, quietly, began to wonder if they came from within, if the soul, not the stars, wrote them. And yet, through all the arguing, through all the ink and incense, one truth stayed the same. People still longed to escape their waking selves. It wasn't about sin or salvation anymore. It was about curiosity, that soft, dangerous hunger to feel differently, to understand life from another angle, even for a moment. It's strange, isn't it? We've built machines, skyscrapers, medicines that can still the heart and restart it again. And yet the impulse remains the same as in Gertrude's day, to taste something that changes the rhythm of thought. So maybe the real story of medieval intoxication isn't about madness or magic at all. Maybe it's just the story of people trying again and again to find a softer place in the world, the kind of place you reach at the edge of sleep, the kind of peace that doesn't ask questions, it just hums quietly, like rain on the roof. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Is the air still, or can you hear a window rattle somewhere? Maybe a storm, maybe a passing train. That sound, that small reminder of distance, is what connects you now to those centuries of dreamers. Because in every age, there's someone awake at night, chasing the same slow drift into comfort. If you close your eyes for a moment, you might feel it, the strange echo between their nights and hours. The hum of a modern refrigerator could almost be the hiss of a hearth. The glow of your screen could almost be candlelight reflected on a wall of plaster and lime. The centuries are thin when the body is tired. Now picture a tavern at the edge of a medieval town, a few centuries after Gertrude's disappearance into the woods. It smells of smoke, wet wool, and fermented apples. A minstrel hums in the corner, his voice low, the melody half forgotten. On the rough table sits a jug of ale brewed with herbs. Groot, they call it, a mix of yarrow, wild rosemary, and a pinch of henbane. The drink is not just intoxicating, It's unpredictable. One man laughs too loudly, another stares dreamily at the fire. A third falls silent, eyes wide, murmuring about angels. Outside, snow begins to fall, covering the sound of the city. The innkeeper refills the mugs and shakes his head. He's seen it all before. A little madness, a little sleep, and sometimes the two are the same. Before hops became the safe, steady flavor of beer, these Groot ales ruled Europe. Each brewer had a secret mix. Some made you drowsy, some wild, some strangely peaceful. But the church disliked how unpredictable they were. Hops, by contrast, were calm, bitter but obedient. So as the centuries turned, the world's favorite drink became tamer, less dream, more order. It was the same story everywhere, a slow retreat from mystery toward measure. What once was called magic became medicine. What once was sacred became science. But human nature doesn't change so easily. Even as alchemists turned into chemists, the same curiosity lingered. People still looked for ways to reach that soft twilight between reality and reverie. The only difference was the language. In monasteries, it had been visions. In villages, it was charms. By the Enlightenment, it became experiments. A physician might test how opium soothed pain without knowing he was repeating what Catherine had done with her mad honey centuries before. An astronomer might stay awake for 3 nights, staring at the sky, sipping a bitter tincture to keep the mind sharp, without realizing he was inhaling the same alkaloids once burned in church incense. The means evolved. The yearning did not. And so, sleep, the most ancient drug of all, remained both a mystery and a cure. It's strange to think how much power that simple act held over them. A peasant might pray before bed, not for wealth or rain, but simply for good dreams. "Lord," they whispered, "let me not wander too far." Because sometimes people didn't come back from sleep. There were tales of those who slept for days, their breathing steady, but their minds elsewhere. Some called it divine ecstasy, others witchcraft, others sickness, but all agreed dreams were dangerous ground. In some villages, sleepers were never moved, for fear the souls wouldn't find a way home. A candle was kept burning beside them, a faint beacon in the dark. To sleep deeply was to travel. To dream was to risk not returning. And yet, they longed for it. Even now, when you lie down and feel the slow dissolve of thoughts into rhythm, aren't you doing the same? Trusting the invisible, letting go of control, stepping into a place that's half death, half revelation? Maybe that's what made the Middle Ages so endlessly human. They weren't afraid to give dreams weight. They treated sleep as an art form, a nightly pilgrimage. And for all our progress, we've lost some of that reverence. We analyze dreams, graph our sleep cycles, count the minutes of rest. But do we still listen to what sleep says? Medieval people did. They thought dreams carried messages from God, from fate, from the self. A baker's wife might dream of a white dove and bake bread for the sick the next day. A soldier might dream of a field of poppies and refuse to ride to war. Sometimes those decisions changed lives. Sometimes they saved them. The rational mind can scoff, but the body remembers. It remembers that faint hum before sleep, that ancient pulse that says, "You are safe now." And when we burn candles scented with lavender, or drink warm milk at midnight, or listen to slow rain through a window, aren't we performing the same small rituals they once did? The same sleepy spells? Maybe we're not so modern after all. There's an old manuscript from a Benedictine abbey in 1481. The margins are filled with doodles, stars, vines, a cat chasing a mouse. In the corner, the scribe wrote a tiny note to himself. If the words grow heavy, I shall close my eyes, and perhaps God will write the rest. I like to imagine he did. That he fell asleep at his desk, quill slipping from his hand, and dreamed of pages that filled themselves. And maybe, as the candle burned low, a little puff of incense smoke curled above him, carrying that ancient mixture of poppy and myrrh, the smell of every century that ever wanted peace. Because that's all any of them really wanted. Not rebellion, not rapture, just rest. And somehow that makes the medieval world feel very close tonight. So, before we drift toward our own dreams, let's linger a bit longer. The night is patient, and the story still has one more breath to take. Outside, the rain has stopped. The silence that follows is thick, like a blanket thrown over the earth. The fire, or maybe a screen, burns low and steady. This is the hour the Middle Ages knew best, the time between wakefulness and whatever comes after. If we could stand now and look backward across the centuries, we would see thousands of small lights flickering in the dark, hearths, candles, oil lamps. Behind each one, someone is fighting the same tender battle you do each night, to drift, to trust, to let go. In one house, a merchant's wife rubs crushed chamomile into a cup of warm wine for her restless child. In another, a monk in a stone cell breathes incense that smells faintly of cedar and sleep. A farmer stretches his limbs under rough linen and listens to the wind. All of them share the same fragile hope. That morning will come, and that tonight their minds will be kind. And yet, their sleep wasn't like ours. Medieval nights were divided not by clocks, but by darkness itself. People often slept in two shifts. The first sleep came soon after dusk, deep and dream-heavy. Then, sometime past midnight, they woke naturally, sat by the fire, prayed, whispered, made love, or pondered the next day. This watch between sleeps was considered holy, even healing. Some said it was when angels whispered to mortals. Others just used it to check the hearth or tell quiet stories. Then came the second sleep, gentler, lighter, filled with softer dreams. Science would later call it segmented sleep, but they simply called it the rhythm of the night. Think of it, whole villages breathing in unison, half awake under stars, half dreaming under wool. The world itself seemed to sleep in two heartbeats. In those hours between rests, imagination wandered freely. People claimed to see spirits, to solve problems, to write poems. Thomas Aquinas supposedly composed parts of his theology in dreams between his two sleeps. And a peasant in England once swore he had spoken to his dead wife at the hearth during that silent interval, as clear as candle flame. Whether miracle or mind's trick, it soothed him. He went back to bed and lived peacefully for years after. Dreams then were not interruptions. They were visitors. You could invite them with a prayer or ward them off with a sprig of rue above the door. Children were taught small verses to say before closing their eyes, "Let no dark thing ride my breath tonight." The words work not by magic, but by comfort, the same way a lullaby still does. Because truly, what is a lullaby but a tiny spell we cast against fear? The lullabies of the Middle Ages were filled with strange tenderness. One from Normandy begins, "Sleep, my heart, the stars keep watch, even sorrow sleeps tonight." Another from an English manuscript whispers, "Rest thy bones, the earth will turn without thee." That line always makes me pause. because it's both a comfort and a truth. The world turns whether we wake or not. Sleep is how we practice letting it. It's no wonder they wove so much faith into their dreams. To sleep well was to believe in continuation. To dream was to trust that tomorrow still existed. And maybe that's why so many medieval remedies for sleeplessness involved ritual as much as herb. A person might wash their feet in warm milk, reciting the psalm, "Thou makest me to lie down in peace." Another might burn dried rose petals on the hearth and whisper the name of someone they loved, believing affection softened the air. Others simply listened to wind, to bells, to the breathing of those beside them, because sound, more than anything, connected them to the living world. There's a document from 14th century Paris describing the city at night. The bells, the dogs, the far laughter of wine cellars, the cry of the watch. And yet, the writer adds, it is not a noise, but a great breathing. That's what the night was to them, a single, enormous breath shared by all. When you think of it that way, the medieval world doesn't feel so far away. Maybe your own city hums with that same breathing right now. Traffic, wind, the rhythm of your own heart join in the old chorus. The tools have changed, the lights have multiplied, but the wish is the same. We still chase comfort through the night, still make little pacts with sleep. Some do it with lavender candles, others with glowing screens, others with the soft repetition of stories like this one, words falling like rain until the mind quiets. If you've made it this far, you're already part of that ancient tradition. The listener, the dreamer, the traveler, standing at the border of waking. And maybe, if you listen closely, you'll hear the whisper of the past, the murmur of monks, the sigh of healers, the hum of bees making mad honey, a chorus of forgotten lives, all saying the same thing in their own languages. Rest now. They would understand your exhaustion. They would understand your longing to pause the noise because they had it too. So breathe. Let your body remember the old rhythm, the first sleep, the waking, the second sleep, the small eternal cycle of trust. You're not alone in it. You never were. The candle has almost melted to nothing now. The last of the wax clings to the base, trembling in its small pool of gold. If you listen closely, there's only the faintest hum in the room, the kind that exists between sound and silence. This is where all the stories end, not with a shout, but with a breath. Somewhere in that old, eternal night, the last monk finishes his copy of a prayer book and closes it gently. The last herb woman ties up her bundle of roots and hangs them to dry. The last traveler finishes his mug of honeyed ale and leans his head against the wall. The world exhales, and maybe that's what sleep really is, the exhale of history. Every night, we step into it without knowing, carried by instincts older than language, older than fear. We like to think we've evolved, that our sleepless minds are something new. But the truth is simpler. We've just traded the howl of wolves for the hum of machines. The darkness still breathes the same way. Imagine, for a moment, that you could drift backward through the centuries as you fall asleep. The walls fade, the cities dim, the hum becomes the sea. You'd pass through the quiet bedrooms of time, stone huts, candlelit cloisters, low timber cottages, each with a sleeping figure, farmers curled beside dogs, sailors dreaming of home, queens dreaming of peace, monks dreaming of light. They all look strangely alike, Eyes closed, faces soft, the same fragile trust written across them. You'd see Agnes, the nun with her jars of herbs, whispering over a bowl of green ointment. You'd see Gertrude, the midwife, vanishing into the forest with her book beneath her arm. You'd see Brother Mathieu riding by lamplight, pausing to smell his garden one last time. And in a cottage near the Black Sea, you'd see Katrine, the apothecary's widow, dipping her finger into mad honey and tasting both sweetness and danger. They're all here, scattered across the centuries like stars in the same sky, and you're part of that constellation now. Another small flame in the endless dark, keeping the same ancient vigil for peace. You can almost hear their voices if you listen long enough, not words exactly, but a rhythm, the sound of the world dreaming. Somewhere in those dreams, bees still hum in the heather. Somewhere, bread still rises with its secret heat. Somewhere, the smoke of frankincense still curls toward a ceiling painted with angels. And over it all, that quiet refrain: sleep, sleep, sleep. The modern world has forgotten how holy that word once was. In the Middle Ages, people said that sleep was God's little death. But they didn't mean it morbidly. They meant it kindly. That each night the world dies a little so that it can be reborn with the dawn. Even now, when you close your eyes, you're performing that same ceremony. You're letting go of the day, of its noise, its brightness, its relentless pace. You're stepping into the same darkness that carried kings and beggars alike. You don't need to fight it. You don't need to understand it. You only need to trust the way they once did, that the world will keep turning without you for a while. That morning will come, and that somewhere, the bees are still making honey in the dark. So breathe with them, slowly, in like the sea drawing its tide, out like a candle sighing its last light. The night accepts you now. The long dream begins. In it, perhaps you'll walk through a field of poppies where monks and healers gather side by side, smiling at your curiosity. Perhaps you'll meet that quiet part of yourself that remembers what the earth smells like after rain. Perhaps you'll find nothing at all, just warmth, just rest, just the great stillness that waits beneath every heartbeat. Whatever you find, it's yours. And when you wake, because you will, you'll carry a trace of them with you. The patience of the monks, the courage of the healers, the wonder of a world that saw no shame in dreaming. The story ends here, but the rhythm doesn't. It continues in your breathing, in your pulse, in the slow turning of the world toward morning. So let the last light fade. Let the silence deepen. And if you must think one last thought before drifting away, let it be this: every age has its dreamers. Tonight, you are one of them. Good night.